All right. Well, the HVAC system has kicked in just as I've started recording another video tonight. As you can see, this comes from the Game Design Reader, which seems sort of unusual for me, but it'll make sense, I think, once we get into it. This is A Theory of Play and Fantasy by Gregory Bateson. And so, let's take a look at Gregory Bateson. Let's see if we can find a good picture of him. Not so many good ones on his Wikipedia. Which one is he? So this is Rudolf Arnheim, which is sort of interesting. I actually thought of including him in this class, but it's like, all right, it's already a little too eclectic. We can't get every eclectic 20th century intellectual into one class. But Gregory Bateson is here. Gregory Bateson may be most famous, I don't know if he's most famous for, but probably most famous for being the partner of Margaret Mead, more than any of his life partner, romantic companionship of some kind. But yeah, you can see that he has a section of his Wikipedia called Spouses. So he had three, but definitely Margaret Mead, the most famous. These other spouses do not have Wikipedia pages of their own. So Margaret Mead, let's actually take a look at her for a second. Her page. She's a cultural anthropologist. She wrote this very significant book, Coming of Age in Samoa. Still sort of influential today. There were some people that were really negative about it. One guy sort of made his whole career debunking it. Turned out he himself ended up being debunked. He falsified a lot of ethnographic research about Margaret Mead, but she was sort of a celebrity academic in the 20th century. And there weren't that many of them. I don't know if there's that many of them today. And the ones today are of a far lesser stature than Margaret Mead, I would say, at least in terms of their contributions to the field. People like Steven Pinker, who might be, I can't bear to see him coming on, chiming in with his awful opinions. But anyway, Margaret Mead was a public intellectual. And so she was a cultural anthropologist, made significant contributions to that field. She's mostly associated within anthropology with the area of this, something called the South Pacific, Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea is a territory that still sometimes I think is worthy of some interest beyond the merely anthropological. I want to say merely anthropological, because part of Margaret Mead did was sort of think about anthropology in a broader spectrum, what anthropology tells us and what it shows us about culture and life in general. But West Papua is a occupied territory. So ongoing strife there, like you might have heard of Western Sahara or various regions in the world that struggle under continued occupation. Of course, there are the situation of Northern Ireland and of the occupied Palestine. So it's one of these places that has all sorts of interesting cultural features, but also relevance to contemporary struggles and contemporary politics. So Margaret Mead was married to Gregory Bateson, but Gregory Bateson, we don't want to just say, okay, yeah, but behind every great woman there's a man, right? No, okay, that's not how the adage goes. But Bateson was maybe less famous than Margaret Mead, but he was also famous in his own right at his own time. He was also a public intellectual. He's associated with lots of different things. He's sometimes associated with a group called the Palo Alto Group. And this is like a very weird sentence to be one sentence in your biography. In Palo Alto, California, Bateson and his colleagues, footnote, these are some of the colleagues, none of whom are very well known. They're mostly known as the Palo Alto Group. Developed the double-bind theory of schizophrenia. It moves on. Okay. Sort of weird. But I think that theory is maybe less interesting as a theory of schizophrenia than it is as a way of thinking of what the framework of theory that we're working under, which could be thought of as cybernetics. Cybernetics. We still hear about the word cyber sometimes. Cybernetics was a field Bateson didn't invent, but he was one of the sort of second generation of researchers within this field of research that was very much about bringing together different kinds of fields. So sometimes if you ever hear people talk about feedback, this is a concept that comes from cybernetics. And it now just sort of means any kind of commentary that you give, but you can think about it as also being the feedback from a guitar. Well, comes from cybernetics being like, well, all of these systems share certain features, whether it's a communication system between human beings or whether it's a communication system of an amplifier in a theater or something like that. That we can think about these as communication systems. They have yes, specific features, but they also have some general features that connect them. So this was a way of doing research that was very influential, had major effects, but nobody calls themselves this anymore. I think maybe there's sort of groups of odd people who sort of meet every once in a while, and they keep on the flame of these sort of things, but really it's not an active research program. So once again, sort of like we talked about with George Herbert Mead, the symbolic interactionist, there aren't really a lot of symbolic interactionists anymore, but this sort of broad, interdisciplinary, sort of crazy, chaotic thing ends up being really important in communication. You seeing a theme emerge? The foundations of communication theory might really require people to be looking at lots of different things together. So Bateson is thinking about anthropology, of course, but he's also going to the zoo, as we'll hear about in the piece that we're about to read. He's thinking about psychiatry. He's thinking about animal behavior. He's thinking about all sorts of things. So he's thinking about engineering. So that's what we'll hear about tonight is his theory of play. And play gives him a way of making sense of some aspects of general communication theory. And it comes from a book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. That's sort of, I would say, his magnum opus in terms of the stuff that he wrote. So we get a little context here. A theory of play and fantasy comes from the volume Steps to an Ecology of Mind, a collection of Bateson's essays and writings. Like many of his works, a theory of play and fantasy crosses and recrosses many disciplines, including mathematics, philosophy, communications with an S, and psychology. Okay. And yeah, it says sort of almost the same thing here. All right, now we're beginning the actual piece. This research was planned and started with a hypothesis to guide our investigations, the task of the investigators being to collect relevant observational data, and in the process to amplify and modify the hypothesis. The hypothesis will here be described as it has grown in our thinking. Oh, what a lead up, I'm just keeping it a little bit of a secret for you. Maybe not something you would recommend to do if someone were writing a paper today, but okay, everyone gets to have their effects. Earlier fundamental work of Whitehead, Russell, Wittgenstein, Carnap, Worf, etc. What a list of etc. So etc. literally means end the rest, like So an etc. should be a list that you're able to complete. Well, who else would be in this list? Let's talk a little bit about who these people are. So Whitehead, Russell, Wittgenstein, and Carnap are all philosophers. They're all philosophers who live within the 20th century. So they're modern philosophers. And a lot of them, I think, would be associated maybe with what might be considered analytic philosophy. They all are a little bit different. Russell and Whitehead are thinking a lot about mathematics. And how they're trying to found mathematics in a logical discipline. Wittgenstein sort of interested in that, but then he gets interested in just language in general. He goes off in another direction. Carnap is interested in science and logic, the relationship. So there's a sense of logic. And then Worf, Benjamin Worf, who is a linguist, probably most famous from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that our language, our specific national language that we speak, English, Dutch, French, Afrikaans, Xhosa, whatever it might be, Mandarin, has a sort of symbolic, implicit map of the world in it. So the way that you experience and think changes based on what language you're within. Okay, so there are very many, people use that idea of that hypothesis. Even what Sapir and Whorf say about it's a little bit different, but there are many, that idea often gets associated with them. Any sort of linguistic relativism sort of gets associated with them. So who else is in this list? We had a bunch of philosophers of mathematics and science and a linguist. What should we be imagining here? Well, maybe the thing that holds all of these together is the sense that there's a question about how language relates to the world, or how do we understand what language does or what language is. So all of these philosophers and linguists are interested in this question of what language really is pragmatically. What should we ground it on? What grounds language practice? So that's not very well formulated, but I think that's sort of what holds them together. So he says, all these people end, as well as my own attempt to use this earlier thinking as an epistemological base for psychiatric theory. Epistemological means related to knowledge. So, okay, what's psychiatry going to be based on? Still controversial today. You're like, oh, well, it's based on the DSM-5. Well, what if there's going to be a DSM-6? What about the DSM-4? What happened to that? That was a foundation once. Also, what goes into the DSM? Who decides what's in there? Pretty big questions, actually, for psychiatry. What makes something a psychiatric disorder? How is that decided? These are epistemological questions. They could be framed as epistemological questions of how does anyone know anything within psychiatry? How do we know that it's not all just a bunch of guesswork? Or, people saying whatever. What holds it together as a field of knowledge? That's not so clear. Sorry, I have some sourdough on my wedding ring because I was making sourdough, so I have to get that off. Okay. So it leads him to think of a number of generalizations. Generalizations can be bad, but they can also be helpful when we're trying to get a big picture view of stuff. So 1, that human verbal communication can operate and always does operate at many contrasting levels of abstraction. These range in 2 directions from the seemingly simple denotative level, the cat was on the mat. One range or set of these more abstract levels includes those explicit or implicit messages where the subject of discourse is the language. So, I don't like your tone. So I can say the cat is on the mat, I'm referring to something out there. Or I can talk about how you're talking or how I'm talking. So that's a little bit different. We will call these metalinguistic. For example, the verbal sound cat stands for any number of such class of objects, or the word cat has no fur and cannot scratch. Maybe tone of voice isn't the best one for metalinguistic because it's really referring to language itself. So language describing language. The other set of levels of abstraction we could call metacommunicative. My telling you where to find the cat was friendly, or this is play, or I don't like your tone. That would be the metacommunicative. And the subject of discourse is the relationship between the speakers. Okay, good enough. I would maybe quibble with the sense that it's a relationship between the speakers. It could be, doesn't have to be. We could still have metacommunicative stuff that's not about the relationship between speakers, but close enough for jazz. It will be noted that the vast majority of both metalinguistic and metacommunicative messages remain implicit. And also that, especially in the psychiatric interview, there occurs a further class of implicit messages about how metacommunicative messages of friendship and hostility are to be interpreted. 2, if we speculate about the evolution of communication, and here he means literally, how did we evolve the human capacities to communicate? How did animals evolve these? So you have to buy into evolution here, which Bateson, he's not going to argue that with you. If you don't buy into evolution, he's like, you're not going to get this stuff we're talking about. You're not within the scientific worldview. For him, that's fundamental to the scientific worldview, is accepting evolution. So, it is evident that a very important stage, speaking of animal behavior, here comes the cat. A very important stage in this evolution occurs when the organism gradually ceases to respond quite automatically to the mood signs of another and becomes able to recognize the sign as a signal. That is, to recognize the other individuals and its own signals are only signals, which can be trusted, distrusted, falsified, denied, amplified, corrected, and so forth. So I don't immediately respond to someone saying, woof, woof, because I'm like, I know this story about the boy who cried woof. But then I think more about the story, be like, didn't he eventually say woof at the end? All of that means I'm in a symbolic mode of communication. I'm not responding automatically. Okay. Clearly, this realization that signals are signals is by no means complete, even among the human species. That's a funny way of putting it. He's throwing a little shade right there. Be like, oh, we haven't really completed the process, have we? We all too often respond automatically to newspaper headlines as though these stimuli were direct object indications of events in our environment instead of signals concocted and transmitted by creatures as complexly motivated as ourselves. What a wonderful way of putting that. But today people don't respond to newspaper headlines. What we would say today, people respond to clickbait. Or once we call it clickbait, we've already sort of made we've made the interpretation that it's a signal, But what do we respond to? You can think of the things people respond to. Maybe people talk about brain rot today. Be like, I'm not really even like absorbing it. I'm not kind of thinking critically about it at all. Just sort of experiencing it. Maybe it's something like that. But I think he's saying that people sort of someone's telling you a story in the news. You're like, wow, that's crazy that happened. You're like, well, wait a minute. Someone's telling you the story. It's like any other story. Maybe it happened, but did it happen exactly like that? Is it the whole story? These other questions we could have if we treated it more as a signal rather than as a fact. The non-human mammal is automatically excited by the sexual odor of another. And rightly so, inasmuch as the secretion of that sign, that's a funny way of putting it, is an involuntary mood sign. That is an outwardly perceptible event, which is part of the physiological process, which we have called a mood. In the human species, a more complex state of affairs begins to be the rule. Deodorants mask the involuntary olfactory signs. One hopes, unless you get that like Tom's stuff that doesn't really do anything. In their place, the cosmetic industry provides the individual with perfumes which are not involuntary signs, but voluntary signals, recognizable as such. So it's different if you're like, I'm a beaver. I have musk. I put out this signal. It's not because I'm like, I'm feeling sort of special tonight. I'm going to put out some musk. That's happening. That's involuntarily happening to me. I don't understand it. I don't have any theory about it. Whereas if I go and choose a scent, I'm like, I'm wearing slate tonight. I'm wearing, wish I knew cologne names. I don't know any names of cologne, so you could fill in here whatever an appropriate one would be. I'm choosing a signal here. And not only that, the person that smells it will be like, I like the smell of your cologne. Your eau de cologne. Meaning that they recognize that I recognize that it's a signal, right? So it's very self-conscious. That's a different kind of communication than animal communication. So something new has emerged. Many a man has been thrown off balance by a whiff of perfume, and if we are to believe the advertisers, it seems that these signals, voluntarily worn, have sometimes an automatic and autosuggestive effect, even upon the voluntary wearer. So now he's adding in the other complication is like, it sort of does go back to being involuntary, right? Anyway, maybe it does. I think he's trying to be a little bit funny here, but I think he's also serious. It's one of those moments where someone's half joking. It's like, yeah, but it sort of is like that, isn't it? Be that as it may, this brief digression will serve to illustrate a stage of evolution. The drama precipitated, begun, when organisms, having eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, discover that their signals are signals. So here he's making an allusion to the Hebrew Bible, the story of Adam and Eve. So when they eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they know what's good and bad. They gain some sort of knowledge. It's forbidden knowledge, though, right? It puts them into a new state. In the way that the Bible story goes, it puts them into a fallen state. So something bad happens morally, but it's also a state where they know more. So there's this sort of play off of these two things. You knowing something, and then you're in a different state that he's using here. Not only the characteristically human invention of language can then follow, but all the complexities of empathy, identification, projection, and so on. And with these comes the possibility of communicating at the multiplicity of levels of abstraction mentioned above. The first definite step in the formulation of the hypotheses guiding this research occurred in January 1952. I love this story. When I went to the Fleischhacker Zoo in San Francisco. This theory, he's like building up. He's like, I will make a hypothesis. He's like, it all began one day. I went to the zoo with my friend. We got popcorn. It really, they did. They did sort of have a good time at the zoo, I think. To look for behavioral criteria which would indicate whether any given organism is or is not able to recognize that the signs emitted by itself and other members of the species are signals. In theory, I had thought out what such criteria might look like, that the occurrence of metacommunicative signs or signals in the stream of interaction between the animals would indicate that the animals have at least some awareness, conscious or unconscious, that the signs about which they metacommunicate are signals. Okay, so how do animals metacommunicate? They can't say in language, I don't like your tone. So how do they do it? Let's go take a look at the zoo. This is, I don't want to say it's old-fashioned, because I think it would be sort of, it could be pretty innovative to do something like that today. But it's not something that people tend to do a whole lot. It doesn't feel like to me. Being like, I have this question. Let's go just like a look around and see what we think about it based on some observations. So not exactly scientific in the sense of you're stepping into a lab, but what else would the lab be? other than maybe something like the zoo? What would be the lab for communication, to make observations about communication? It would be sort of weird to say, like, oh, we want to understand how humans interact. Let's bring them into a sterile room and environment where there's no one around. That might not be a great spot to observe human communication. So there's this sort of issue with communication research. A little bit of an aside here, but sort of issue with communication research is if you want to observe the real thing, it might not live under scientific conditions. So science will often go to great lengths to establish experimental conditions that are controlled, that are organized, so that they can specify exactly which variables are being affected in the experiment. Well, with human communication, there's just so many, everything's a variable. Every single twitch of the eye and every word and gesture could potentially be meaningful. How do we control for that? How do we observe this at all? It's a big problem for how you do communication research. So some people will make the Faustian bargain. They'll say, we're going to ignore a lot of stuff. And we are going to go into the laboratory conditions because at least we prefer that control over the genuine article. We just want to know about the things that we can control for. And other people will be like, I don't know, we got to stay out here in the weird, wild world. And how certain our knowledge will be, I don't know, but I want to look at the real thing. So this is a sort of two roads diverged question. Okay, I knew, of course, that there was no likelihood of finding denotative messages among non-human mammals, but I was not aware. So when he says denotative messages, what would that be? Words. He's like, I didn't expect to hear any talking chipmunks out there. Alvin! So he's making a little joke here about his own language, I think, just being so... but yeah, also he sort of talks like this. But I was still not aware that the animal data would require an almost total revision of my thinking. Wow. What I encountered at the zoo was a phenomenon well known to everybody. I saw two young monkeys playing, that is, engaged in an interactive sequence of which the unit actions or signals were similar to, but not the same as, those of combat. It was evident, even to the human observer, that the sequence as a whole was not combat, and evident to the human observer that to the participant monkeys, this was not combat. Now, this phenomenon, play, could only occur if the participant organisms were capable of some degree of metacommunication, that is, of exchanging signals which could carry the message, this is play. The next step was the examination of the message, this is play, and the realization that this message contained those elements which necessarily generate a paradox of the Russellian or Epimenides type, a negative statement containing an implicit negative meta-statement. So without going into all of the different things that he's referencing here, maybe you've heard of the liar's paradox, which goes like this: I'm lying to you. Is that statement true or false? Well, okay. If it's true, then the statement means I'm lying to you, which means that it's false, right? So it creates this paradox. And there's lots of ways that people have more or less successfully resolved this paradox. So this is what he's sort of thinking about. He's like, this would create a paradox. So the idea being here be like, this is play, meaning the thing that I'm doing to you, I'm not really doing to you, right? There's some sort of contradiction involved in the play message. Be like, this real thing that we're doing, not for real. Play is like that. Okay. Expanded, the statement, this is play, looks something like this. These actions in which we now engage do not denote what those actions for which they stand would denote. Okay. I'm biting you, but not for real. We now ask about the italicized words for which they stand. We say that the word cat stands for any number of cats, members of a certain class. That is, the phrase stands for is a near synonym of denotes. If we now substitute which they denote for the words for which they stand, in the expanded definition of play, the result is these actions in which we now engage do not denote what would be denoted by those actions which these actions denote. The playful nip denotes the bite, but it does not denote what would be denoted by the bite. Okay, do you get this? So when I nip you, I'm saying, haha, I'm biting you. But if I bit you, that would mean I'm angry at you. It doesn't mean that. Okay. I think if it's not clicking yet, give it a little bit longer. It might start to click as you hear more of his examples of how he talks about this. According to the theory of logical types, such a message is of course inadmissible because the word denote is being used in 2 degrees of abstraction, and these 2 uses are treated as synonymous. But all that we learn from such a criticism is that it would be bad natural history to expect the mental processes and communicative habits of mammals to conform to the logician's ideal. So logic can't do it at all, unfortunately. This is quite obvious to, I think, most people that have studied logic and then gone on to do something else. But there's 2 classes of people who imagine that logic can do it all. One, people who have never studied logic. They're like, logic, that's where it's at. Want to make things logical. They never studied it, but they know that that's what it is. Because for them, logic just means whatever makes sense, whatever's true, whatever's right. That's what logical is. And then there's the people who have obsessively, permanently studied logic, and they see logic wherever they go, so they can't get it out of their head. But if you study it for a little bit and then you go on to do other things, you're like, well, okay, this is not all about logic in the philosophical sense of logic, in the mathematical sense of logic, that it can all be represented in this very strict way. Maybe not. How do we represent play? Okay. Indeed, if human thought and communication always conform to the ideal, Russell would not, in fact, could not have formulated the ideal. Logicians typically do not write their books logically. Their books about logic are not written in logical notation. Important point. Many have aspired. Few have succeeded. Thank God, because they would be really horrible to read, I would imagine. A related problem in the evolution of communication concerns the origin of what Korzybski has called the map-territory relationship, which is that the map is not the territory, that's the relationship. The fact that a message of whatever kind does not consist of those objects which it denotes. The word cat cannot scratch us. Well, depends, but yeah, okay, you get the idea. Rather, language bears to the objects which it denotes a relationship comparable to that which a map bears to a territory. Denotative communication, as it occurs at the human level, is only possible after the evolution of a complex set of metalinguistic, but not verbalized, rules which govern how words and sentences shall be related to objects and events. Sometimes people have called this grammar. That's sort of what Noam Chomsky talked about. We talk about universal grammar. We have somehow in our brains, we have sort of a structure for learning language, which is related to how we've evolved to be in the world, something like that. There are other ways of thinking about what is involved in those unstated ways that we put language together, but again, we don't have time for every single weird thinker in the 20th century. But there's a lot of thought about that. It is therefore appropriate to look for the evolution of such metalinguistic and or metacommunicative rules at a pre-human and pre-verbal level. It appears from what is said above that play is a phenomenon in which the actions of play are related to or denote other actions of not play. We therefore meet in play with an instance of signals standing for other events, and it appears therefore that the evolution of play may have been an important step in the evolution of communication. Well, that's sort of nice. We're on to a new section. 6. Threat is another phenomenon which resembles play. Oof, you must have had a rough upbringing. In that actions denote, but are different from other actions. Okay, so, just in that respect, right? So like, I'm warning you, sometimes you might threaten someone in a very basic way with a fist. Well, what does that mean? Be like, I could punch you. So it's denoting the punch, but it's not the punch, right? That's what makes it a threat. If you punch someone, you're not threatening them. Unless you're like, I'm threatening to do something worse than punching you. You ever seen Killing of a Chinese Bookie? Okay. So yeah, maybe someone beating up you was a threat. I didn't kill you, but I could kill you, right? So it denotes something that it is not, is what the threat means. The clenched fist of threat is different from the punch. Wow, there you go. But it refers to a possible future, but at present non-existent punch. And threat also is commonly recognizable among non-human mammals. Indeed, it has lately been argued that a great part of what appears to be combat among members of a single species is rather to be regarded as threat. And what are these things that are here in parentheses? These are the last names of the people whose ideas he's citing. One of these, Konrad Lorenz, big kahuna, another big kahuna in animal behavior, wrote a book about aggression. Histrionic behavior and deceit are other examples of the primitive occurrence of map territory differentiation. And there is evidence that dramatization occurs among birds. A jackdaw may imitate her own mood signs, and deceit has been observed among howler monkeys. Yeah, and every year there's more of this kind of stuff, I think, where people who are ethologists, people who study animal behavior, will be like, the things that we said animals couldn't do, well, it turns out they sort of can do them. They can do a lot of things. When we observe them more closely, we see animal behavior is very complex and full of things that we didn't recognize were there until we looked closely. We might expect threat, play, and histrionics to be three independent phenomena, all contributing to the evolution of the discrimination between map and territory. But it seems that this would be wrong, at least so far as mammalian communication has occurred. Very brief analysis of childhood behavior shows that such combinations as histrionic play, bluff, playful threat, teasing play in response to threat, histrionic threat, and so on form together a single total complex of phenomena. And such adult phenomena as gambling and playing with risk have their roots in the combination of threat and play. It is evident also that not only threat, but the reciprocal of threat, the behavior of the threatened individual, are a part of this complex. It is probable that not only histrionics, but also spectatorship should be included within this field. It is also appropriate to mention self-pity. Okay, so first of all, what's histrionics? Histrionics literally mean, in a very narrow sense, means acting. Any kind of acting. But we usually, when we say someone's being histrionic, oftentimes we mean that they're emotionally overreacting. They're not acting appropriate to the situation that they find themselves in. Like a bad actor, maybe, might on a stage. You're overacting. You're hamming it up. So how negative his judgment of histrionics is here, he does seem to imply that sense of, well, why is it like threat and why is it like play? It's because you're sort of acting something up. You're exaggerating something. It's not quite the same thing that you mean it to mean. It's like, I'm acting as if I'm angry. I am angry, but the way I'm acting is much greater. It's more exaggerated than the anger that I feel. A further extension of this thinking leads us to include ritual within this general field, in which the discrimination is drawn, but not completely, between denotative action and that which is to be denoted. Anthropological studies of peacemaking ceremonies, to cite only one example, support this conclusion. In the Andaman Islands, peace is concluded after each side has been given ceremonial freedom to strike the other. This example, however, also illustrates the labile nature of the frame. This is play, or this is ritual. Labile means, it's slipping and sliding around. It's can be adjusted. The discrimination between map and territory is always liable to break down, and the ritual blows of peacemaking are always liable to be mistaken for the real blows of combat. This sort of happens sometimes when, like, in baseball, a pitcher's like, nicks a batter, gives him a bow tie, or something like that, right? Gets really close, and you're like, oh, okay. Well, maybe, it was just a wild pitch. If he then hits him after that, people get angry. And then the next pitcher will come out, and then he'll hit the guy, and everyone will clear the benches and go at it, Okay. In this event, the peacemaking ceremony becomes a battle. But this leads us to the recognition of a more complex form of play. The game which is constructed not upon the premise this is play, but rather around the question, is this play? And this type of interaction also has its ritual forms. In the hazing of initiation. Okay, how do you like your Greek life house that you live in? Okay, so maybe you got hazed. Well, there's hazing in lots of institutions. I mean, one of the things that's maybe sort of depressing about the way we talk about hazing is we ignore it. We ignore it largely. We pretend that it doesn't happen. But we also don't really talk about how it functions. So we pretend that it doesn't happen so that we can sort of morally shame everyone who engages in hazing rituals. But hazing rituals exist in all sorts of institutions. That doesn't mean that they're good. I'm not necessarily condoning it. I'm talking about it just is an anthropological reality of a great part of institutional life. In the military, at a workplace, in places where there are even minimally complex social orders, there's often hazing in terms of initiation. Why is that? It would be worth thinking about it. One of the anthropological short anthropological pieces that my friend David Landis put me onto, shout out David, who's in New Orleans now, I hear, is Eating Christmas in the Kalahari, which is about a tribe that would always make fun of whoever caught the biggest catch during hunting, or ever got the biggest game. They'd be like, ooh, it's looking pretty weak, right? Sort of an obvious thing of just sort of keeping you humble. Yeah. That's not exactly the same as hazing. I think that's actually quite nice. It's a very charming cultural institution to sort of make fun of this person in the Kalahari Desert who's really good at hunting. You should be like, keep everyone sort of part of an equal society, because you have to do a lot of things together. It's a society that depends upon equality, so that virtue has to be practiced in this way by making fun of people. But yeah, why does hazing exist? That might be, rather than just sort of condemning it morally, if we wanted to get rid of it, maybe it would be good to investigate a little bit. Why does it happen? Maybe it has some kind of function for groups of a certain size or for certain kinds of institutions. Paradox is doubly present in the signals which are exchanged within the context of play, fantasy, threat, etc. Not only does the playful nip not denote what would be denoted by the bite for which it stands, but in addition, the bite itself is fictional. Not only do the playing animals not quite mean what they are saying, but also they are usually communicating about something which does not exist. Wow, good for the animals. Be like, why is that a good thing? Well, you can think about from this sort of idea of language that Bateson is operating from. It would be, the idea of something not existing, being able to talk about it, that would be pretty abstract. So that's pretty high level thinking that apparently these animals are able to do. At the human level, this leads to a vast variety of complications and inversions in the fields of play, fantasy, and art. Conjurers and painters of the Trompe-l'œil school, this means like optical illusions and stuff like that, concentrate upon acquiring a virtuosity whose only reward is reached after the viewer detects that he has been deceived and is forced to smile or marvel at the skill of the deceiver. There's a great story about these two Greek painters who are having a contest. Zeuxis and Parrhasius are their names. And I think Zeuxis is the one. Yeah, Zeuxis goes first, and he paints this Trompe-l'œil image of a woman carrying a basket of grapes, and it's so good the birds kind of come and start pecking the grapes, right? The birds are fooled. Pretty good trick. And he says, okay, Parrhasius, your turn. Unveil your painting. Parrhasius says, I can't. Why not? Are you ashamed because my painting is so good? No, because the painting is the veil. And Zeuxis is like, you win. I tricked the birds, but you tricked Zeuxis. You tricked me. So that's pretty good. So we can admire these sort of moments of deceit. There's something that we like about them, about mimesis, about imitation, trickery. Okay. Hollywood filmmakers spend millions of dollars to increase the realism of a shadow. Well, maybe you're putting on a little thick there. Maybe not. These days they just get some kind of visual effects artist to come in and do it. Other artists, perhaps more realistically, insist that art be non-representational. And poker players achieve a strange addictive realism by equating the chips for which they play with dollars. They still insist, however, that the loser accepts his loss as part of the game. Finally, in the dim region where art, magic, and religion meet and overlap, human beings have evolved the metaphor that is meant, the flag which men will die to save, and the sacrament that is felt to be more than an outward and visible sign given unto us. Here we can recognize an attempt to deny the difference between map and territory, and to get back to the absolute innocence of communication by means of pure mood signs. Okay, so you're starting to see it. As he's writing, he's developing his own sense of the words that he is using. So when he's talking about mood signs, you got to think back to when he was talking about moods before, as moods being this sort of physiological process that animals, such as this one, also use as well as human beings. So when we are doing apparently pretty complicated things like dying for our flag or participating in a religious sacrament, you can think about the doctrine of the real presence, that the bread and wine are the real body of Christ. It's not a metaphor. Yeah? So he's talking about that as an attempt to say the symbol and the reality are one thing. There's something about that that's very powerful as an idea for human communities. What is powerful about that? Why? He says, a dim region where art, magic, and religion meet. Something about that. We desire that. That's very powerful for us, were that to be possible. We face, then, two peculiarities of play. That the messages or signals exchanged in play are in a certain sense untrue or not meant, and B, that which is denoted by these signals is non-existent. These two peculiarities sometimes combine strangely to reverse a conclusion reached above. It was stated before that the playful nip denotes the bite, but does not denote that which would be denoted by the bite. But there are other instances where an opposite phenomenon occurs. A man experiences the full intensity of subjective terror when a spear is flung at him out of the 3D screen. Oh gosh, IMAX, Odyssey. Or when he falls headlong from some peak created in his own mind in the intensity of nightmare. At the moment of terror, there was no questioning of reality, but still there was no spear in the movie house and no cliff in the bedroom. The images did not denote that which they seemed to denote, but these same images did really evoke that terror which would have been evoked by a real spear or a real precipice. By a similar trick of self-contradiction, the filmmakers of Hollywood are free to offer to a puritanical public a vast range of pseudo-sexual fantasy which otherwise would not be tolerated. In David and Bathsheba, Bathsheba can be a Troilistic link between David and Uriah. So if you know the story of Bathsheba, Bathsheba is married to this guy Uriah. And David, who's the king, he's friends with Uriah, but he sees Bathsheba and he's like, she is really, really attractive. So he sends Bathsheba, he has him be put on the front lines of a battle, knowing he will probably die. He does die, and then he marries Bathsheba. Sort of pretty dirty business even for a king. Pretty gross. And in Hans Christian Andersen, the hero starts out accompanied by a boy. He tries to get a woman, but when he is defeated in this attempt, he returns to the boy. In all of this, there is, of course, no homosexuality, but the choice of these symbolisms is associated in these fantasies with certain characteristic ideas. For example, about the hopelessness of the heterosexual masculine position when faced with certain sorts of women or with certain sorts of male authority. In some, it's sort of going all over the place, this is like what Bateson, the eclecticism. It's like, okay, he's talking about gambling, he's talking about the Andaman Islands, he's talking about being at the zoo, he's talking about problems in logic. This is what it's like, to lay the foundations of communication theory. You're going all over the place. In some, the pseudo-homosexuality of the fantasy does not stand for any real homosexuality, but does stand for and express attitudes which might accompany a real homosexuality or feed its etiological roots. Etiology means the causes. So the reasons why someone might be homosexual. What those are, I don't know. Don't ask me. I don't really want to know what Bateson thought were the reasons. The symbols do not denote homosexuality, but do denote ideas for which homosexuality is an appropriate symbol. Evidently, it is necessary to re-examine the precise semantic validity of the interpretations which the psychiatrist offers to a patient. And as preliminary to this analysis, it will be necessary to examine the nature of the frame in which these interpretations are offered. So all of this has been sort of a setup to come back to psychiatry, which is his main concern, right? We talked about the double bind theory of schizophrenia. I don't think he talks about that here, but he's concerned with psychiatric diagnosis. What really is that? What's going on in the situation where one person diagnoses another with a mental illness? What has previously been said about play can be used as an introductory example for the discussion of frames and context. In sum, it is our hypothesis that the message, this is play, and then this we have to read the box. All statements within this frame are untrue. I love you. I hate you. Okay. Establishes a paradoxical frame comparable to Epimenides' paradox. Excuse me, Epimenides. This frame may be diagrammed thus. The first statement within this frame is a self-contradictory proposition about itself. If this first statement is true, then it must be false. If it be false, then it must be true. But this first statement carries with it all the other statements in the frame. So if the first statement be true, then the others must be false, and vice versa. If the first statement be untrue, then all the others must be true. The logically minded will notice a non sequitur, which means, it doesn't follow. Something's sort of gone off in the logic. It could be urged that even if the first statement is false, there remains a logical possibility that some of the other statements in the frame are untrue. It is, however, a characteristic of unconscious or primary process thinking that the thinker is unable to discriminate between some and all, and unable to discriminate between not all and none. It seems that the achievement of these discriminations is performed by higher or more conscious mental processes, which serve in the non-psychotic individual to correct the black and white thinking of the lower levels. Now, I just want to come out here and say, I do not agree with this argument. I would even say there's pretty strong evidence against some of the things that he's about to say. So it might be worthwhile to say, then why bother reading such a thing? If we were in a biology class, you wouldn't teach me a kind of theory of biology that wasn't true. Well, when we're talking about the theory of communication, the concepts that we have about communication might be sort of created out of various kinds of mistakes or errors, but still be useful to think with. And it can sort of also be more useful to think with if we know some of the errors that people could have arrived at. So I'm going to keep reading this, but I'm going to give you my opinion about where this goes wrong and how we can still use some of these thoughts in order to do work today or think about things today. Okay. We assume that this is to be an orthodox assumption, that primary process is continually operating, and that the psychological validity of the paradoxical play frame depends upon this part of the mind. So I guess the part I disagree with here is there is not a part of the higher mind, I don't think, that is reserved for these logical processes. And I think the Bateson selection task, and there great research done on that, has shown this. So you can go look into that if you're interested. But conversely, while it is necessary to invoke the primary process as an explanatory principle in order to delete the notion of some from between all and none, this does not mean that play is simply a primary process phenomenon. The discrimination between play and non-play, like the discrimination between fantasy and non-fantasy, is certainly a function of secondary process, or ego. Within the dreamer is usually unaware that he is dreaming. Within play, he must often be reminded, this is play. Similarly, within dreamer fantasy, the dreamer does not operate with the concept untrue. I wonder about that. I feel like I've recognized people in dreams are lying before. I'm saying, you're lying, you're a liar, you know. But anyway, let's go on the basis of this assumption. He operates with all sorts of statements, but with a curious inability to achieve meta-statements. He cannot, unless close to waking, dream a statement referring to, that is framing, his dream. Sometimes people talk about lucid dreaming, in which case you can do this, but people recognize that as a different kind of dreaming, right? So there is some respect in which there's some experiences of dreams anyway, even if it's not all dreaming, where you can't access the idea that you're in a dream. The dream is working pretty hard to hide this from you because it's trying to keep you asleep, right? You know, that's the dream's job. So it doesn't want to be like, it's a dream, time to wake up. It therefore follows that the play frame, as here used by an explanatory principle, implies a special combination of primary and secondary processes. This, however, is related to what was said earlier, when it was argued that play marks a step forward in the evolution of communication, the crucial step in the discovery of map-territory relations. In primary process, map and territory are equated. In secondary process, they can be discriminated. In play, they are both equated and discriminated. Interesting. Another logical anomaly in the system must be mentioned, that the relationship between two propositions, which is commonly described by the word premise, has become intransitive. Okay, so I'm going to skip over some of this because he's getting to be a little bit too technical, I feel like, here. Really what he's saying, so what's a premise? A premise is, in a syllogism, the statements, we have a major premise and a minor premise. The two statements that we relate in order to come to a conclusion. But in some of these things, we're not able to draw conclusions. That's really what he's saying. Even though we have the statements that otherwise, and if we were outside of that frame, we would be able to draw conclusions. All this, however, leaves unclear what is meant by frame and the related notion of context. To clarify these, it is necessary to insist first that these are psychological concepts. I'm not sure I agree with that. We'll see. We use two sorts of analogy to discuss these notions. The physical analogy of the picture frame and the more abstract, but still not psychological analogy of the mathematical set. In set theory, the mathematicians have developed axioms and theorems to discuss with rigor the logical implications of membership in overlapping categories or sets. The relationships between sets are commonly illustrated by diagrams. Okay, so what's an example? We could have the set of the natural numbers. Okay, we have 1 in there and we have 2 in there. Then we have the set of even numbers. We have 2 in there and we don't have 1 in there, right? So 2 belongs to both of those sets. 1 only belongs to one of those sets. -1 belongs to neither of those sets, so on and so on. Such diagrams then illustrate a topological approach to the logic of classification. The first step in defining a psychological frame might be to say that it is or delimits a class or set of messages or meaningful actions. The play of two individuals on a certain occasion would then be defined as the set of all messages exchanged by them within a limited period of time and modified by the paradoxical premise system which we have described. In a set theoretical diagram, these messages might be represented by dots, and the set enclosed by a line which would separate these from other dots representing non-play messages. The mathematical analogy breaks down, however, because the psychological frame is not satisfactorily represented by an imaginary line. We assume that the psychological frame has some degree of real existence. In many instances, the frame is consciously recognized and even represented in vocabulary. Play, movie, interview, job, language, etc. His etceteras are like crazy. I'll have this crazy list. I'll be like etc. at the end of it, no matter what. I'll always say etc. In other cases, there may be no explicit verbal reference to the frame, and the subject may have no consciousness of it. The analyst, however, finds that his own thinking is simplified if he uses the notion of an unconscious frame as an explanatory principle. So what are they talking about here? You got to think about the analyst here is the psychoanalyst. People today would call it their therapist. And there's a sort of a reason why therapists and analysts, they belong to the same set in some cases, and different sets, they're sometimes independently in. But psychoanalysis was extremely popular in the United States and all over the world as a form of therapy. It's sort of where all the other forms of therapy that we have today do come originally from psychoanalysis. There's some today that I would say more resemble psychoanalysis than others. So, maybe you might be doing rapid eye movement. That's pretty different from psychoanalysis. You might be doing something like cognitive behavioral therapy, pretty different, but still has this talking component. Or you might be doing something like dialectical behavior therapy, pretty strong relationship to psychoanalysis, but pretty different historically. Or you might be doing something where you'd be like, I just sort of tell my therapist what I'm thinking and feeling. That's pretty close to psychoanalysis. Yeah. So all of these different frames are there, but the difference is that the psychoanalyst, the way that therapy went is they made interpretations about what you said. So in other forms of talk therapy, someone might give you advice, or they might give you techniques about what to do. In analysis, they give you an interpretation. Or truly, hardcore analysts will be like, you have to come to your own interpretation, right? But they'll sort of help you do that by framing things in some ways. So something weird you might be saying something that's weird. Maybe it's an error of speech. That's why they call it a Freudian slip. Or maybe you have a weird dream. And as the analyst is listening to you talk over and over, be like, every time that we come into this, when you talk about these sort of things, you use all of the language like you're in the bathroom. You always use metaphors of the bathroom. Did you ever notice that? It's almost like you're imagining yourself being back in a bathroom. Why might that be? And then you might see that you've been operating at the level of language within a frame that you weren't aware of. Okay, so that's sort of how psychoanalysis works. It's weird. It's uncomfortable. A lot of people hate it, but it is a thing that many people have practiced, and some people have found great relief in, and some people have found other interesting things about psychoanalysis as a theory. Okay. Rather than the actual physical frame is, we believe, added by human beings to physical pictures, these human beings operate more easily in a universe in which some of their psychological characteristics are externalized. It is these characteristics which we are trying to discuss, using the externalization as an illustrative device. So he's saying it's actually more like a picture frame. So the picture frame is something we say, that's not the picture. But it does contribute to how we think or feel and how we perceive the picture, right? The picture frame. So that's how to understand one of these symbolic frames or meta-communicative frames. The common functions and uses of psychological frames are now can be listed and illustrated. By reference to those analogies, whose limitations have been indicated in the previous paragraph. Psychological frames are exclusive, that is, by including certain messages or meaningful actions within a frame, certain other messages are excluded. Psychological frames are inclusive, that is, by excluding certain messages, certain others are included. From the point of view of set theory, these two functions are synonymous, but from the point of view of psychology, it is necessary to list them separately. The frame around a picture, if we consider this frame as a message intended to order or to organize the perception of the viewer, says, attend to what is within and do not attend to what is outside. Sometimes I try to explain this by talking about, if we thought about fear and hope rationally versus emotionally. Okay, I don't think that they are totally separate, reason and emotion. But if I fear something is going to happen. But if I have 100% certainty that it's going to happen, I don't fear it, I despair or whatever. Fear means there's some probability that it doesn't happen. So it's also part of fear. Well, you could call that hope. So anytime you fear, you also hope. I fear that something happens, I hope that it doesn't. Or I hope that something happens, I fear that it won't. So they always are felt both ways. But the experience of fear is very different than the experience of hope. And that's why it's sort of, the mathematical framing or the logical framing doesn't get us to something that he's talking about, like the picture frame. The picture frame creates something that's outside of it and something that's inside of it. But we feel very different about those two relationships. Those mean things that are very different to us. When I'm fearful of something, I'm thinking about the thing that I'm afraid of, not about the fact that it might not happen, about this sort of negation of it. That's not what my feeling is about. Psychological frames are related to what we have called premises. The picture frame tells the viewer that he's not to use the same sort of thinking in interpreting the picture that he might use in interpreting the wallpaper outside the frame. Or in terms of the analogy from set theory, the messages enclosed within the imaginary line are defined as members of a class by virtue of their sharing common premises or mutual relevance. The frame itself thus becomes part of the premise system. Either, as in the case of the play frame, the frame is involved in the evaluation of the messages which it contains, or the frame merely assists the mind in understanding the contained messages, by reminding the thinker that these messages are mutually relevant, and the messages outside the frame may be ignored. Okay, pretty long-winded, but he got to his point. D, in the sense of the previous paragraph, a frame is metacommunicative. Any message which either explicitly or implicitly defines a frame, ipso facto, means, by that very thing, by that fact, gives the receiver instructions or aids in his attempt to understand the messages included within the frame. Hey, look at it this way. The converse of D is also true. Every metacommunicative or metalinguistic message defines, either explicitly or implicitly, a set of messages about which it communicates. That is, every metacommunicative message is or defines a psychological frame. This, for example, is very evident in regard to such small metacommunicative signals as punctuation marks in a printed message, but applies equally to such complex metacommunicative messages as the psychiatric's definition of his own curative role, in terms of which his contributions to the whole mass of messages in psychotherapy are to be understood. Now, there's a lot in that. That's a complicated idea. But here's an example that might help bring some of it into clarity. He talks about punctuation marks. Sure, in a lot of ways, punctuation marks are metacommunicative. Pause here. Take a breath. This is the beginning of the clause. This is, these clauses are the same, whatever. But think about when you get that text. Be like, he put a period. He said bye with a period. And you got to get all your girlfriends to come and be like, well, what does it mean? And you're like all looking at this and getting angry about it and freaking out about it, right? So that period communicates something about a relationship, about a tone, about a style. So there you go. The relationship between, it's a frame. The relationship between psychological frame and perceptual gestalt needs to be considered. And here the analogy of the picture frame is useful. In a painting by Rouault or Blake, the human figures and other objects represented are outlined. Wise men see outlines and therefore they draw them. But outside these lines, which delimit the perceptual gestalt or figure, there is a background or ground which in turn is limited by the picture frame. Let's take a look at one of Blake's images, because I think if you see some of these might be better than others in order to illustrate this point. Yeah, so here's one that sort of has its frame. It's not just sort of clipped out of it. Reject all. Jerusalem, the emanation, the giant Albion. Albion being a name for England. So we have this frame, and then we have sort of the always weird drawings of William Blake, the poet, inside of that. Okay. Outside these lines, which delimit the perceptual gestalt or figure, there is a background or ground which in turn is limited by the fixture frame. Similarly, in set theoretical diagrams, the larger universe within which the smaller sets are drawn is itself enclosed in a frame. This double framing is, we believe, not merely a matter of frames within frames, but an indication that mental processes resemble logic in needing an outer frame to delimit the ground against which figures are to be perceived. So the figure-ground relationship, this is something that also sometimes gets its own analysis in psychology, specifically in Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt, means something like the form of a thing that has emerged. And there is still sort of a branch of psychology called Gestalt psychology, which was interested in how our perceptual forms come to be and how that relates to our cognitive forms and things like that. So a lot of times it gets experienced by being like, oh, can you see like the Gestalt form? Can you see the figure in the ground here between, well, what counts as figure and what counts as ground? If you treat the black as the figure and the white as the ground, you will see something like a goblet or a candlestick. If you treat the black as the ground and the white as the figure, you see, maybe two silhouettes of faces talking to each other. That's the idea here, that the figure-ground relationship is always invertible. Always invertible. It might always give you, a clear other thing. It might not be constructed like an optical illusion, but you can change this. So the frame sort of helps us make that determination. What is figure and what is ground? And that goes way beyond visual perception to, people use that as, I think, sort of a metaphor, but also sort of literally, for communication. What is figure, what is ground? If we think about the play analogy being like this little paw that I'm having is actually not the figure, it's not the thing I want you to think of, it's the ground for this other message, which is we're playing. Sort of a weird way of interpreting things, but that's what he's going for, I think. But the items to be included in the background set must be of the same degree of abstraction, that is, of the same logical type as those within the set itself. Specifically, if paradoxes be avoided, the class of matchboxes and the class of non-matchboxes must not be regarded as members of the class of non-matchboxes. No class can be a member of itself. The picture frame, then, because it delimits a background, is here regarded as an external representation of a very special and important type of psychological frame. A frame whose function is to delimit a logical type, right? So a category of thing. That's what the frame is doing. Treat this. Take this as a category. Take this as a type. This, whatever is in here. This, in fact, is what was indicated above when it was said that the picture frame is an instruction to the viewer that he should not extend the premises which obtain between the figures within the picture to the wallpaper behind it. But it is precisely this sort of frame that precipitates paradox. The rule for avoiding paradoxes insists that items outside any enclosing line be of the same logical type as those within. But the picture frame, as analyzed above, is a line dividing items of one logical type from those of another. In passing, it is interesting to note that Russell's rule cannot be stated without breaking the rule. Okay. Russell insists that all items of inappropriate logical type be excluded by an imaginary line from the background of any class. That is, he insists upon the drawing of an imaginary line of precisely the sort which he prohibits. We don't have to worry about this. Russell's one of the philosopher-mathematicians that was trying to do these things and ran into a bunch of paradoxes. Okay. This whole matter of frames and paradoxes may be illustrated in terms of animal behavior, where three types of message may be recognized or deduced. A, messages of the sort which here could be called mood signs. B, messages which simulate mood signs in play, threat, histrionics. And C, messages which enable the receiver to discriminate between mood signs and those other signs which resemble them. Now, I have to stop here and say, this so closely resembles the semiotics of Charles Sanders Peirce, where he talks about, he has many different versions of this, but index, icon, and symbol. So the index is like the mood sign. I'm in this is sort of my attitude. The icon resembles that, right? Haha, I'm not really punching you, but this fist resembles the punch, which would be the mood sign that I'm really angry. And then C, messages which enable the receiver to discriminate between mood signs and those other signs which resembles them. Sometimes Peirce will call this a legisign because he's like, oh, it's a law for how to interpret other signs. So yeah, very similar to Peircean semiotics for those Charles Sanders Peirce heads out there. The message, this is play, is of this third type. It tells the receiver that certain nips and other meaningful actions are not messages of the first type. The message, this is play, thus sets a frame of the sort which is likely to precipitate paradox. It is an attempt to discriminate between or to draw a line between categories of different logical types. 20. This discussion of play and psychological frames establishes a type of triadic constellation or system of relationships between messages. One instance of this constellation is analyzed in paragraph 19, but it is evident that the constellations of this sort, not only at the non-human level, but also in the much more complex communication of human beings. It is evident that they occur. A fantasy or a myth may simulate a denotative narrative, and to discriminate between these types of discourse, people use messages of the frame-setting type, and so on. Okay. 21. In conclusion, we arrive at the complex task of applying this theoretical approach to the particular phenomena of psychotherapy. Here, the lines of our thinking may most briefly be summarized by presenting and partially answering these questions. A, is there any indication that certain forms of psychopathology are specifically characterized by abnormalities in the patient's handling of frames and paradoxes? Just going towards what will be his theory of what he calls schizophrenia here, which is that people are living, they sort of lose sight of a frame. And they get subject to paradoxical messages that they can't deal with. And so, in some sense, you could see, well, what would be the cure there? The establishing of a frame. Whether it's the original one or not, as long as it's workable, we're good to go. So weirdly, framing becomes a therapeutic technique. Is there an indication that techniques of psychotherapy necessarily depend upon the manipulation of frames and paradoxes? Is it possible to describe the process of a given psychotherapy in terms of the interaction between the patient's abnormal use of frames and the therapist's manipulation of them? In reply to the first question, it seems that the word salad of schizophrenia can be described in terms of the patient's failure to recognize the metaphoric nature of his fantasies. That part I would agree with. I don't know if I agree with all the reasons that Bateson came to that decision, but I do think that that's about right when it comes to schizophrenia. The schizophrenic is sort of working with metaphorical language in a way where they're taking it very literally, often. In what should be triadic constellations of messages, the frame-setting message, for example, the frame as if, is omitted, and the metaphor or fantasy is narrated and acted upon in a manner which would be appropriate if the fantasy were a message of the more direct kind. The absence of metacommunicative framing, which was noted in the case of dreams, is characteristic of the waking communications of the schizophrenic. With the loss of the ability to set metacommunicative frames, there's also the loss of ability to achieve the more primary or primitive message. That's the primary message. I'm sleepy. The metaphor is treated directly as a message of the more primary type. Okay, let's keep going. The dependence of psychotherapy upon the manipulation of frames follows from the fact that therapy is an attempt to change the patient's metacommunicative habits. That's interesting. So not how we communicate. That's not what we're changing in therapy. We're changing how we talk about how we communicate, or how we use other sort of signs about how we communicate. Before therapy, the patient thinks and operates in terms of a certain set of rules for the making and understanding of messages. After successful therapy, he operates in terms of a different set of rules. And it follows that in the process of therapy, there must have been communication at a level meta to these rules. There must have been communication about a change in rules. But such a communication about change could not conceivably occur in messages of the type permitted by the patient's metacommunicative rules as they existed either before or after therapy. So you can see that here's the weird these totally apparently different scenarios of animals playing at the zoo and someone being treated for schizophrenia in psychoanalysis have the same sort of structure for Bateson, because the problem comes up of how does someone communicate about communication if they don't have already set up a language to do that. a separate language to talk about language that they're in? How do they do it within the language? How do you create a frame if you're inside of the picture? Yeah. So this is an interesting problem. The resemblance between the process of therapy and the phenomenon of play is, in fact, profound. Both occur within a delimited psychological frame, a spatial and temporal bounding of a set of interactive messages. In both play and therapy, the messages have a special and peculiar relationship to a more concrete or basic reality. Part of the way that I think he's suggesting therapy works here is you call something that you're doing therapy, and you box it out from the world. You're like, oh, I got to go to therapy. I got my iced coffee, and I hit the gym, and now I have to go to therapy. And therapy is about my life, but it's a separate, something goes on there that's separate from these other. So I'm going to therapy in order to deal with my life. So it's a figure-ground relationship. When I'm in therapy, I don't know how you would think about it. What becomes the figure and what becomes the ground sort of depends on where you are in the therapy, maybe. But yeah, therapy allows you to have a figure-ground relationship with your own life. The formal characteristics, just as the pseudo-combat of play is not real combat, so also the pseudo-love and pseudo-hate of therapy are not real love and hate. So here he's referring to the idea of the transference that comes from Freudian psychoanalysis, which means that you go to therapy. Eventually what happens is you either love or you hate your therapist. And this is important to the therapeutic effect of psychoanalysis, because interpreting who is this really about, that you've sort of identified your therapist with some other situation in your earlier life, usually your earlier life, not your future life. Every picture of me is a picture when I was younger, as the Mitch Hedberg joke goes. So, but usually some very early part of your life, your childhood. Be like, you're treating me in this way. So now we can reinterpret that other frame because you actually have forgotten to establish the frame. So now we can be like, where does the frame need to be? So you can live a life that's sad in the normal way, as Freud sort of joked about how people might come out and be like, yeah, you can be sad in the normal way now. The formal characteristics of the therapeutic process may be illustrated by building up a model in stages. Imagine first two players who engage in a game of canasta according to a standard set of rules. So long as these rules govern and are unquestioned by both players, the game is unchanging. No therapeutic change will occur. Indeed, many attempts at psychotherapy fail for this reason. We may imagine, however, that at a certain moment the two canasta players cease to play canasta and start a discussion of the rules. Well, why do we do it this way? Why are aces high? I don't know anything about canasta. Their discourse is now of a different logical type than from that of their play. At the end of this discussion, we can imagine that they return to playing, but with modified rules. The sequence of events is, however, still an imperfect model of therapeutic interaction. Yeah, no crap. I mean, it's not even, I wouldn't even call it an imperfect model. It's not a model, it's just an analogy. But whatever, though it still illustrates our contention that therapy necessarily involves a combination of discrepant logical types of discourse. Our imaginary players avoided paradox by separating their discussion of the rules from their play. And it is precisely this separation that is impossible in psychotherapy. As we see it, the process of psychotherapy is a framed interaction between two persons in which the rules are implicit but subject to change. Such change can only be proposed by experimental action. But every such experimental action in which a proposal to change the rules is implicit is itself part of the ongoing game. It is this combination of logical types within the single meaningful act that gives to therapy the character not of a rigid game like canasta, but an involving system of interaction. The play of kittens or otters has this character, which is a funny way to end the paragraph. So one thing that might happen in therapy, let's say, is you've been doing therapy for how many years now, right? And you're like, okay, you go to your doctor. Enough of this bullshit. I just want to talk to you for real. You know more about me than some of my best friends. You've known me for years. Talk to me like a friend. Do you like me or not? Am I a good person? A friend would tell me. A true friend would tell me. And not only are you, not only do you know me better than my friends, I pay you. And so it's sort of up to the therapist how to deal with this scenario. It's probably, you might guess, it's sort of bad and unethical for the therapist. You're like, you know what? I am your friend. Or we're like, you know what? I do think you're a giant asshole. I'm going to be real with you. I don't know. Sometimes maybe that happens in therapy and maybe things end up okay. I don't know. Who am I to say? But I would say that's probably not going to be the protocol. But even someone sort of rejecting and saying, well, no, we can't do that. We have to do therapy. Well, what's therapy? Tell me what you think, what you feel. Well, this is what I feel, doc. I don't want to do therapy anymore. So this is why we can't totally separate in therapy the game and the rules, or the game and the talk about the game. In regard to the specific relationship between the way in which the patient handles frames, the way in which the therapist manipulates them, very little can be said. It is, however, suggestive to observe that the psychological frame of therapy is an analog of the frame-setting message which the schizophrenic is unable to achieve. To talk in word salad within the psychological frame of therapy is, in a sense, not pathological. Indeed, the neurotic is specifically encouraged to do precisely this, narrating his dreams and free association so that the patient and therapist may achieve an understanding of this material. So the neurotic, who is that? That's pretty much everybody in psychoanalytic theory. There's three ways you can be. You can be neurotic, you can be perverse, or you can be psychotic. Okay? So the schizophrenic is an example of a psychotic person, and a neurotic person is someone who is, you have some troubles, you have some symptoms, you might have anxiety and depression, but you can also talk about them. What does it mean to be perverse? Someone who's perverse is someone who probably doesn't go to therapy because they're having their own good time. They're having their good time. So someone who was a sadist might be an example of someone who's perverse. Someone who takes pleasure in hurting other people. Well, a lot of the leadership of our world seems to be of this class of people. They're like, I'm doing great. I'm winning. Straight dubs. It's for the perverts. But anyway, that's psychoanalysis speaking, not me, of course. I wouldn't ever use any of those terms. Framing. For the schizophrenic, the problem is somewhat different. His error is in treating the metaphors of primary process with the full intensity of literal truth. Through the discovery of what these metaphors stand for, he must discover that they are only metaphors. From the point of view of the project, however, psychotherapy constitutes only one of the many fields which are attempting to investigate. Our central thesis may be summed up as a statement of the necessity of the paradoxes of abstraction. It is not merely bad natural history to suggest that people might or should obey the theory of logical types in their communications. Their failure to do this is not due to mere carelessness or ignorance. Rather, we believe the paradoxes of abstraction must make their appearance in all communication more complex than that of mood signals. And hopefully we have a little bit more than that. And that without these paradoxes, the evolution of communication would be at an end. Life would then be an endless interchange of stylized messages, a game with rigid rules, unrelieved by change or humor. What a nice way to end this essay, where he's like, we've talked about these paradoxes as problems, as what can be solved, how things can go wrong. But really what he's used these examples of play and therapy to show us is at totally different levels of, I think for Bateson, animal play might be a kind of relatively simple form of communication. And I think he would think of therapy as an extraordinarily complex set of communicative relationships. So by using these two ends, he's sort of saying it runs the whole gamut, folks. We're shot full in communication with paradoxes of communication. And we should celebrate that. One of those sort of, that generation of paradox, that's where our humor is. That's where the joy of life is. That's where eroticism might live. That's where pleasure is. That's where interest is. Scientific curiosity might arise because of this. So we don't want to get rid of paradoxes, but we might want to study them. And then it's a bunch of notes that you can go read if you are really, really excited about this piece. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed a little time with Gregory Bateson tonight. Stay tuned for more on the Rhetoric Central stream. I used to be Rhetoric Prof. That's an abandoned YouTube channel which you can find. But back on Rhetoric Central stream, we'll be making lots more of these videos. And let me know. Again, as always, if you have comments on this, if you think it could be better or worse, I'm sure it could be worse, but what you didn't like about it, what you did, and I'll try to make them better.